Hello, welcome to week 2, History of Jazz, third video lecture for the week. King Oliver, Dippermouth Blues, also from the Smithsonian Collection of Classic Jazz. No accident that these foundational recordings are the short lectures for this week. They are not the only foundational ones, but they are of great import. Again, some comments from Swed's Jazz 101. Note the spelling, by the way, S-Z. W-E-D, not S-U-E-D-E. Okay? For your comments, please get the spelling right. Thank you. Here we go. Dippermouth, as in Dippermouth Blues, is from the Week 2 YouTube playlist, was King Oliver's nightly feature, his big hit, and his solo on the first recording of it, April 1923. It was striking. They'd been playing it for a decade already. Okay. It wasn't until 1923 it was recorded. The original Dixieland Jazz Band, an all-white group, recorded several years before this happened. I'm not ho-humming it because it's not as simple as that. The ODJB, as they are known, made great contributions to early jazz. They did. They're the first recorded group, period. But there are reasons why they got the chance to record before African-American musicians did, who the ODJB had been modeling their work on. Jazz was popular music by 1923. It was the jazz age, right? These were iconic figures already by the end of the teens. King Oliver particularly was. So, his nightly feature, his big hit, meaning he played every night, basically. Jazz bands played every night. Jazz bands were playing to dancers every night. And again, as we talked about with Joplin and with Morton in the context of this week's lectures, they were playing jazz compositions, right? Dippermouth Blues is a jazz composition. It is a blues, okay? And we'll talk about the blues form as we start to unpack this. It says that listening to it now is musical archaeology. And it takes some discipline to hear through the murk of the acoustic recording, right? We just alluded to the difficulties of sometimes evaluating as our source materials the recordings of early jazz when it's simply very difficult to hear almost anything clearly separated from each other. In the ensemble, these are not multi-track recordings with sophisticated mixes in which you can hear each instrument when you need to in the most crystalline way. It's the opposite of that, in fact. Musical archaeology is like we've dusted off something meticulously, and yet still we're left with this sort of imperfect artifact, right? It's an artifact of great importance, but it is not, in the condition it was in when it was functioning in its time, right? It's what's the word I'm looking for? It's an artifact from an early era. Okay. What you find when you dig away this archaeology, this sort of the dust off of this artifact, Swed is saying. When you do, you find the two trumpets of King Oliver and Louis Armstrong. There's not the first mention of Louis Armstrong's name in this course, but now we're going to be talking about Armstrong, right? Armstrong played in Oliver's band. He apprenticed with King Oliver until his musical personality was too huge to be contained anymore, and he went out on his own. He came up in King Oliver's band. What you find when you dig away the dust and get your ears really tuned to what's hearing, Swed says, is the two trumpets of Oliver and Armstrong playing the melody while clarinetist Johnny Dodds winds around them, gracing their lines. There's that ornamentation we're discussing, right? In this case, two people playing the melody strong, doubling even. To the same instrument, doubling, giving it punch, perhaps harmonizing some of it, playing most of it in unison, clearly delineated melody, clarinet, snaking up and under and around and back, ornamenting, making that empty Christmas tree have lots of pretty ornaments on it. It's the analogy I always use for ornamentation, right? Making the music come to life in an improvisatory, spontaneous kind of way. It is Dodds who solos first with two dark variations on the blues, using lines he most likely worked out in advance. There's something, a couple things. Soloing using blues scales, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7. Blues inflection, bending notes. Clarinet is a wonderfully human instrument. You can bend pitch. You can slide up to a pitch. You can trail off a pitch. You can flutter a pitch, tremolo a pitch, use vibrato. You can do all these things to humanize the pitch you're creating with your voice through that instrument. Those blues inflections are flatting notes, microtonal, less than half-step sized grazings around a pitch area, including those real strong clang, tritone sounding, flatted fifth kind of textures. In the context, major, minor, doesn't matter. Any tonality, giving it that blues inflection. And yet it says, using lines he most likely worked out in advance. No one will say for sure. Dodds never said categorically. And yet we gather that just like in ragtime, various ragtime composers, not just Joplin, just like in Morton's masterpieces of jazz composition, here we have this example of improvisatory and prescripted elements working simpatico. And that includes even still in the improvisatory solo statements. Johnny Dodds plays a solo, but he does so by riffing on something that he's already worked out. That is different than an different than a strictly improvisational solo. There are some improvisational, in the moment stuff happening, but you're bringing materials to the table already. All of a sudden, it's not out of the blue. Contrast that, if you would, with what we heard last week. Hawkins, some licks, but a lot of stuff out of the blue. Rollins, a couple decades later, a couple licks, quotes from this and that, but it wasn't. Those are not scripted quotes. Think about the improvisatory Flights of Fancy Scott LaFaro, the bass player in Bill Evans' trio takes. None of that is scripted. They are making it up. They are improvising. Johnny Dodds, by contrast, here. Ornamenting. Johnny Dodds is an older player. It's a different sensibility. We talk about collective improvisation in New Orleans-style music. Note, this was recorded, again in 1923, after the music had been playing in and around both New Orleans and, again, rural centers in the South. Even by now, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, other urban centers. Still, those musics were kind of collectively improvised is kind of a misleading way of describing them, because they were collectively assembled, including improvisation, including ornamentation, including pre-written riffs, right? Like collective improvisation seems to imply a kind of freedom for all, and yet Dodds's freedom here is to pull out a bag that he has already. Here's my chance to play a solo. Well, here's my solo statement that I've prepared, and we'll play more or less the same every night. The important change that happens here is Louis Armstrong, and here's from Swed. He says, the ensemble returns, this time with Armstrong playing the lead to set up Oliver's solo of 3 choruses. Solo might not be quite right, as the band can be heard playing softly behind him. Well, that's still a solo. This is the feature that had audiences at the Lincoln Gardens in Chicago shouting to a trumpet solo that literally preached to the audience. Oliver's one hand holding the trumpet and fingering the valves, the other working a small mute in the bell of the horn at the front of it to get a talking effect. It is also one of the first examples on record of a coherent, well-built, powerfully improvised solo, with each of the 3 courses relating to the others in a systematic, thoughtful manner. Check out the distinction between Dodds's hauntingly beautiful, blues-inflected clarinet choruses that are nonetheless kind of scripted, and, by contrast, Oliver's testifying, preaching, vocal. Those can all still be scripted. The distinction is, though, that they're improvised. They were not licks that he had ready to go. He made the stuff up. This is one of the first examples of recorded evidence, not just stories that someone said about Buddy Bolden or Bunk Johnson or some of these other apocryphal early figures of jazz that we have read about, but we don't know what they sound like. With Oliver, we hear him making stuff up in the moment and becoming a model for Louis Armstrong as a result. It says it was a solo heard by trumpet players around the world and was copied note for years, later even arranged for whole trumpet sections of swing bands to play in harmony. What an irony to think about, right? What do we value about Oliver's improvisation? That it is so unique and so off the cuff and so genius in a way that you could only make something up in the moment rather than just in its absolute, craftsmanship or anything like that. No, it's the aliveness of it, and yet it becomes this solo that is literally transcribed, meaning the notes are taken down. That's an E, that's a B flat, that's a C, that's that rhythm, that's that rhythm. Okay, someone notates it, and then played note for note. Someone's playing an improvisation note for note. We have a very interesting dialectic thing happening here in which I keep saying jazz is all about improvisation. It is. But then is it jazz if someone plays King Oliver's solo, this great example of recorded improvisational, new territory, in a non-improvised way, note for note? It still can be. Hence the imperfections of all these definitions. What makes something jazz? Well, it's almost like what makes something not jazz might be something to think about. Is this a piece of jazz piece, even without Oliver's improvised solos, with all the other sort of prescripted stuff that happens, and the ornamentation, but not real soloing that happens? It is. But it's early jazz. And the transition that we're going to start to understand the next couple weeks is that the kind of improvisation we're talking about in early jazz, whether it's Joplin, the beginnings of jazz, early 20th century, whether it's Joplin, whether it's Morton, whether it's Oliver, whether it's early Louis Armstrong, as opposed to the Armstrong that came in the 20s and beyond. Those are, for the most part, ornamentation and extrapolational versions of improvised solo statements rather than completely original statements that didn't come from anywhere and weren't just slight modifications. And this, King Oliver's Dippermouth Blues, and perhaps by necessity because of the recording, focus on Oliver. That's all you're going to hear anyways, at least when he's soloing. Try and listen for that absolute originality in his ideas that not only are original to everyone who came before him, but are like original on that recording. Here's some new stuff. He didn't prescript any of this stuff. And that originality is where jazz is going from here. We're going to leave behind a lot of these early jazz composition things we talked about in Morton, stop times and breaks. Latin tinge even sort of leaves the music, at least not entirely, but kind of becomes partitioned off to a kind of genre of jazz, whatever, later. But the idea that all these early jazz tropes, the collective improvisation, particularly the polyphony. Polyphony means more than one melodic voice happening at the same time, and the blurred line between what is polyphony and what is heterophony. Polyphony means two independent melodies at the same simultaneously. Heterophony means a melody and multiple ornamented versions of it happening at the same time. In fact, polyphonic early jazz is very often heterophonic. But when you get someone like King Oliver moving the form forward, what happens by the strength of his improvisational statements that are not just ornamenting a Christmas tree, that are whole new constructions, what happens is Louis Armstrong hears what he's playing in his band, literally. Other, Sidney Bechet, the great soprano saxophonist, contemporary of Oliver's and Armstrong's, more or less, older than Armstrong actually, are creating improvisational statements that have the coherence of a composition, as Swed says, relating in a systematic, thoughtful manner. It's not just willy-nilly. We'll talk about willy-nilly when collective improvisation returns in the late 50s and 60s, and whether it's really willy or not. But we're listening to this example in particular because here we go now. We started this whole course. Here's some examples of what jazz iconically is. This week we talked about here's some examples of, and we'll hear also the rest of the YouTube playlist has other examples of these kind of proto early jazz figures. And now, at the end of week 2, we're saying here's King Oliver, not just raising the bar or improving on something that's come before, actually forever changing the face of early jazz to becoming jazz, to becoming all the styles of jazz, because it wasn't really until Oliver more or less recorded a solo of this improvised originality that jazz started to become a improvising soloist's art as much as it was a composer and arranger ornamenter's art. Okay, so that's some thoughts about King Oliver's Dippermouth Blues. Look on week 2 assignment under modules for all the parameters for what to do besides watch these videos. I will say this, reading through week 1 comments so far, I appreciate people's contributions, and I will talk more in the week 2 assignment about specifically what I'm looking for in your writing. Okay, so that's the end of the 3 lectures for week 2.